In the early hours of a quiet morning, as servers hum in data centers and laptops flicker awake on desks around the world, an unexpected question is beginning to surface in forums, comment sections, and late-night tech podcasts. Is Linux, the operating system that once symbolized freedom, control, and rebellion against corporate software, about to face its biggest identity crisis yet? For decades, Linux has been the backbone of servers, supercomputers, cloud infrastructure, and a passionate desktop community that proudly chose complexity over convenience. But as we move deeper into 2026, a strange pattern is emerging. Longtime Linux users are quietly leaving. New users are hesitating. And alternatives that once seemed unthinkable are suddenly gaining ground. This is the story of what many are calling the Great OS Exodus, and the reasons behind why 2026 might be the year Linux loses more users than it gains. To understand why this conversation even exists, we have to rewind time. Linux was never designed to win popularity contests. It was born from a need for control, transparency, and collaboration. In the 1990s and early 2000s, choosing Linux was a statement. You were rejecting proprietary lock-in, rejecting forced upgrades, rejecting opaque systems that treated users like passive consumers. You accepted the learning curve because the reward was freedom. Over time, Linux became the invisible engine of the internet. It powered web servers, smartphones through Android, embedded systems, and even space missions. On desktops, though, it remained niche. That niche survived because it was loyal, vocal, and deeply invested. Fast forward to the early 2020s, and the landscape began to change. The rise of cloud computing blurred the line between local operating systems and web-based platforms. Software that once required native desktop support moved into browsers. At the same time, hardware manufacturers increasingly optimized their devices for Windows and Mac OS, leaving Linux users dependent on community drivers and workarounds. For years, this was tolerated. Linux users were used to fixing things themselves. But tolerance has limits, and by 2026, many users are reaching them. One of the biggest cracks in Linux's armor is fragmentation. What was once celebrated as choice has started to feel like chaos. Hundreds of distributions, multiple package formats, competing desktop environments, and different philosophies about how Linux should work have created an ecosystem that is powerful but exhausting. New users arrive, excited by the promise of Linux, only to be confronted with questions they don't know how to answer. Which distribution should I choose? Why does this app only support one package format? Why does my audio work on one desktop environment but not another? For experienced users, these questions are manageable. For everyone else, they are barriers. In 2026, the average computer user has less patience for friction than ever before. Technology is expected to work instantly and invisibly. When something breaks, users don't want to debug. They want it fixed. Competing operating systems have learned this lesson well. They hide complexity behind polished interfaces, unified app stores, and aggressive hardware integration. Linux, by contrast, often exposes its internal mechanics, whether the user wants to see them or not. This transparency is a strength, but it can also be a weakness in a world obsessed with simplicity. Another major factor driving the exodus is application support. While Linux has made tremendous progress, gaps remain painfully obvious in 2026. Many professional tools still prioritize Windows and Mac OS. Creative professionals rely on software ecosystems that either don't exist on Linux or feel like second-class citizens. Emulation and compatibility layers have improved, but they introduce performance overhead and occasional instability. For users whose livelihoods depend on reliability, even small issues can be deal-breakers. As remote work and freelance careers expand globally, more users are choosing operating systems that guarantee compatibility rather than freedom. Gaming, once a bright spot for Linux optimism, has also become a mixed story. There was a time when it seemed Linux gaming was finally breaking through. Compatibility layers improved, performance gaps narrowed, and more titles became playable. But as game development pipelines grew more complex and anti-cheat systems more aggressive, Linux support became inconsistent. In 2026, many multiplayer titles still struggle or refuse to run at all on Linux. For younger users who see gaming as a core part of their computing experience, this is often the final push toward another operating system. Hardware support is another quiet but powerful force behind the great OS exodus. Modern laptops and desktops are increasingly designed with tight hardware-software integration in mind. Power management, biometric authentication, GPU switching, and AI accelerators often rely on proprietary firmware and drivers. While Linux communities work tirelessly to reverse engineer and adapt, they are always one step behind. In contrast, proprietary operating systems ship with full support on day one. For users who buy new hardware and expect everything to function immediately, Linux can feel like an afterthought. There is also a cultural shift happening within the Linux community itself. For years, pride and technical skill was part of the identity. Knowing how to fix your system was a badge of honor. But in 2026, that attitude is increasingly seen as exclusionary. New users want welcoming communities, clear documentation, and empathy for beginners. While many Linux communities are friendly and supportive, others remain hostile to newcomers. Dismissive responses like "read the manual" or "that's user error" push people away. When users feel judged instead of helped, they don't stay. At the same time, competing platforms have evolved in ways that directly target Linux's traditional strengths. Privacy, once a Linux selling point, is now a major marketing focus for other operating systems. Security features that once required manual configuration on Linux are now enabled by default elsewhere. Even customization, long considered Linux's domain, is becoming more accessible on proprietary systems through extensions and official tools. The gap between what Linux offers and what others provide has narrowed significantly. Another often overlooked factor is time. Linux saves money, but it can cost time. In 2026, time is one of the most valuable resources users have. When an update breaks a system, when a driver requires manual installation, or when a workaround becomes necessary, the hidden cost adds up. For students, professionals, and creators juggling multiple responsibilities, the trade-off is no longer worth it. Paying for an operating system that simply works is increasingly seen as a rational choice, rather than a compromise. The enterprise world tells a slightly different but related story. Linux still dominates servers and cloud infrastructure, but even here, change is underway. Managed platforms, containerization, and abstraction layers mean fewer administrators interact directly with Linux systems. The operating system becomes invisible, managed by tools rather than people. As a result, fewer new professionals are developing deep Linux skills. This has long-term consequences for the ecosystem, as the pool of contributors and maintainers slowly shrinks. Education plays a role as well. In many regions, students grow up using lockdown devices and cloud-centric platforms. They are taught how to use software, not how it works. Linux, with its emphasis on understanding systems, feels alien to this generation. Without early exposure, fewer young users feel motivated to explore it. By 2026, this generational gap is becoming noticeable in community demographics. All of this raises a critical question. Is Linux actually dying, or is it simply returning to its roots? Some argue that what we're seeing isn't an exodus, but a realignment. Linux was never meant to be everything for everyone. Its strength lies in flexibility, not mass appeal. From this perspective, losing casual desktop users is not a failure, but a natural consequence of staying true to its philosophy. Linux continues to thrive where it matters most: infrastructure, research, embedded systems, and innovation. Others, however, worry that the decline in desktop users has deeper implications. Desktop users contribute bug reports, documentation, translations, and community support. They are often the bridge between developers and everyday users. As their numbers shrink, the ecosystem risks becoming insular. Fewer perspectives mean slower adaptation to changing user expectations. In a rapidly evolving tech landscape, that can be dangerous. There is also the issue of funding. Many Linux projects rely on donations, sponsorships, or volunteer labor. A shrinking user base can mean less financial support and fewer contributors. While large corporations continue to invest in Linux for their own interests, community-driven projects may struggle. This imbalance could shift the direction of Linux development in ways that prioritize corporate needs over individual users. Yet, even amid these concerns, declaring 2026 as the year everyone ditches Linux would be misleading. Millions of users remain committed. New distributions continue to appear, exploring fresh ideas and user experiences. The passion that built Linux in the first place has not vanished. Instead, it is being tested. The question is whether the community can adapt without losing its soul. Some see hope in efforts to standardize parts of the ecosystem, improve onboarding experiences, and focus on usability without sacrificing control. Others believe the future of Linux on the desktop lies in hybrid models, where the underlying system remains open, but the user experience becomes more curated. These approaches are controversial, but they reflect a growing recognition that something must change. In the end, the great OS exodus is not about Linux failing. It's about the world changing. User expectations, hardware design, software delivery, and cultural attitudes toward technology have all evolved. Linux can either evolve with them, or accept a smaller, more specialized role. Neither outcome is inherently bad, but pretending the shift isn't happening would be a mistake. As 2026 unfolds, the real story may not be about people leaving Linux, but about why they leave, what they seek elsewhere, and whether Linux can learn from that without abandoning its core principles. The operating system that once challenged the status quo now faces a challenge of its own, proving that freedom and usability don't have to be opposites. Whether Linux rises to that challenge or retreats into the shadows will define its next decade. And for the millions who still believe in what Linux represents, that future is worth fighting for.